absolutely wonderful way to begin our conference, and lively, open and civil debate is I hope what we can look forward to today. So thank you so much, Fiona, that was really wonderful. Great, so I'm now going to introduce our opening keynote speaker, which is Professor Robert Crawford from the University of St Andrews. Professor Crawford, as I'm sure you know, has literally written the book on some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today, including, of course, his book Bannockburns, which came out last year just before the referendum itself. He's been absolutely instrumental both as a poet and as an academic in tackling some of these issues that we've already heard from Fiona today. So thank you so much, Professor Crawford, for being part of our conference today, and welcome to the stage.
Thanks very much, both the organisers and the hosts, for this invitation. No poet, this talk is called Bardic Voice, and it's kind of defence of bardic voice. No poet should feel obliged to engage in his or her work explicitly with politics. All poets should be free to do so, however. A poet who wants to write politically hears two voices. One, the bardic voice, urges him or her to speak on behalf of a community, a tribe, a gender, a nation. The other insists only on truth to the individual self, an unstable self which may elude communal, tribal, gender, or national definition. In Scotland, as in Ireland and many other countries, bardic voice is a strong presence, even in fiction. It's clearly there in Gaelic poetry, when Lachlan Mormacvurich, here in translation, incites his clansmen, be belters, be brandishers, be bonny, be batterers. He's speaking to and for the tribe. Differently inflected, the bardic impulse is there in the public poetry of that Gaelic-speaking Latinist George Buchanan, whose Renaissance Latin epithalamium for the marriage of Mary Queen of Scots to the French Dauphin includes a paean to Scotland, in which Buchanan operates as a proto-poet laureate. In Scots and English, our starriest bard is Burns, Caledonia's bard, Brother Burns, as he was called masonically in this city. Signing himself yours for Scotland and identifying with a heartbreaking little white rose, Hugh MacDiarmid too, like Sorley MacLean, sought out a bardic role, which was for him at times, as it had been on occasion for Burns, a political one. Yet there are other great Scottish poets for whom this bardic voice has been something to eschew, or at least to modify vigorously. William Dunbar can deploy bardic voice, including stinging, satirical bardic voice, for surely flighting is the flip side of bardic encomium. But in that phrase, Ersh, Bribor, Baird, the word Baird, bard, is a lowland. In his lament for the Mackers, Dunbar's truest tribe is simply poets. And not absolutely all those Mackers in that poem are Scottish. William Drummond of Hawthorne Den, the first Scottish poet to write English with complete fluency, was more of a recluse than a bard in his faction-ridden land. And much more recently, Norman MacCaig seemed eager to renounce the bardic in one of his most political poems, Patriot, in which he declares slyly and with vehement individualism, my only country is 6 feet high, and whether I love it or not, I'll die for its independence. The quarrel with himself out of which Yeats made poetry was principally an argument between individual, often erotic lyric voice and bardic voice. There's a related quarrel, surely, within the poetries of Seamus Heaney, Evan Boland, and other recent Irish poets, including Paul Muldoon. The phrase bardic voice sounds a bit old-fashioned. It seems to belong perhaps to medieval Gaelic chieftains, or to that world of declamation set out by Catherine Robson, whose book Heartbeats, Everyday Life and the Memorised Poem centres on the 19th century and has on its cover a kilted schoolboy reciting Robert Burns. Maybe instead of using the term bardic voice, I ought to be referring to poetry that's fitted with its own effective public address system. But I want to stick with the term bardic voice, not least because it emphasises the longevity of poetry as an archaic and abiding, as well as modern art form. Bardic voice is a sound system, both because of the way it orders a system of sounds and because its sense of attunement or attack is an attempt to articulate, however indirectly, something of a sound system of government. Now, I admit the phrase bardic voice still makes us awkward here in the land of James Macpherson. It risks sounding too antique, too bound to the norms of romantic lastness, too oceanic. Yet the term bardic voice is worth using because it signals not just poetry's access to the power of public address, but also because it reminds us how important such access has been in Scotland, Ireland, and elsewhere. Ironically, and maybe because whetted by their long residence in England, there may be more Scottish bardic voice in the English-based Scottish poets W.N. Herbert and Jackie Kay than in some of the best-known Scottish-based poets of my generation. In their poetic practice, John Burnside and Don Paterson have refused to bring bardic voice to issues of national identity and the politics of British unionism or Scottish independence. On rare occasions, Kathleen Jamie, perhaps like Meg Bateman, has adopted bardic voice only to unshackle herself from it, whether in Jamie's The Queen of Sheba or Mr. and Mrs. Scotland Are Dead. Bardic voice can be a temptation, or even an off-the-peg uniform for Scottish poets. The temptation is grandiosity, egotism, and reductivism. The illusion that the nation and the self, the I, are pompously, even bumptiously at one. Now, I recognise that temptation, and yet I remain committed to risking at times elements of bardic voice. From my own first collection of poems, A Scottish Assembly, in 1990, I felt an attraction to the possibilities, not just of so-called private voice, but of kinds of bardic or public voice, of poetry that can articulate aspects of a national community with a subtle but unashamed political inflection. Like many, perhaps most poets of my generation and the preceding generation, I lived outside Scotland for a considerable time in my 20s, and the decision to return here was an act of deliberate commitment. It was during 6 years in England, and not least as the result of a relationship with a refugee, that I came to realise what it meant to me to be Scottish, and some of the things that being Scottish might mean in and for poetry. So I chose for my first book an epigraph from Margaret Atwood. Some people think that the word nationalism means let's all put on jackboots and kill everybody else. But our cultural nationalism has a very modest mandate, namely that we exist. It seems to threaten some people. And that was Atwood being quoted in 1990 in an inexplicitly a Scottish context. But though my first book is by no means all political, its poems, like some of the poems in more recent collections of poetry I've published, go beyond mere cultural nationalism to point in the direction of political independence. My favourite poet remains T.S. Eliot, who once wrote that line, "History is now and England." And my orientation is both instinctively and deliberately Scottish international. My biography of Burns is clearly titled The Bard, and I do believe in the possibilities for Scottish poets still of a bardic stance, but not a simplistic one. Much of what I've written in poetry and prose has been geared to articulating a sense of Scottish identities as complex, and of our poetic traditions as multiple. Hence the title of the early 1990s magazine, Scotland's, a deliberate plural, and the design of the Penguin Book of English Verse, which begins with that Latin masterwork, the Altus Prosator, along with my old teacher Edwin Morgan's striking-facing translation. Hence the resolutely polylingual argument to Scotland's books. Where I say resolutely polylingual, I don't just mean the mantra of English, Scots and Gaelic. I mean also Latin, Old English, Old French, Old Norse, Old Welsh, as well as more recent immigrant tongues, the whole hybrid and gloriously impure caboodle. I admire the way that Morgan for Scots and English, and more recently Meg Bateman for Gaelic, have acted not just as poet, but also as warden and sharer of the hoard, anthologizing, criticising, writing literary history, and translating the poetry of the past without compromising their creative gifts. Bateman and Morgan have fused to a risky yet commendable extent, surely, the professorial and the bardic. Let me repeat that poets don't have to speak for the nation, the gender, the sexual orientation, the tribe, but they can try at times to do so. And at times, such as the 2014 independence referendum, I think that though I do understand why some of the poets I've mentioned resisted doing so in their work, bardic voice, whether it was Liz Lochhead at the National Portrait Gallery channeling Robert Burns, or younger poets reading in village halls, bardic voice was often the appropriate thing to risk. Perhaps now, though, in the period after our independence referendum, we've become even more wary of yoking, as some of us did during the political campaign, poetry and politics. And yes, in the decades since the heyday of Hugh MacDiarmid, many have argued that the two should be kept apart. In 2014, I published a selection of political poems that were part of my book, a collection of poems, Testament, as well as the prose book that was mentioned earlier, Bannockburn's Scottish Independence and Literary Imagination, 1314 to 2014. Neither of these books was simply propagandistic, and yet it would be hard to read either without realising that I support Scottish independence. Now, in 2015, surely it's hard not to feel a shiver of failure. Whatever poets may have done to back the cause, it wasn't enough. All those readings, those would-be bardic songs, those discussions, those attempts to sing a new Scotland into being were almost, but not quite, enough. It wasn't us, of course. It was the economists, the politicians, the rest. They didn't quite get their act together. The months after the referendum, for those among the 45% at least, were months of if only. If only there had been a 6% swing in the other direction. If only the currency question had been more deftly addressed. If only culture had been debated as much as oil. Yet let's face it, fellow bookish ones here in the National Library of Scotland, nobody really issues the lament, if only there had been some better sonnets. Poetry, Auden famously said in his elegy for Yeats, makes nothing happen. Yeats didn't seem to believe that, though. When close to the end of his life, his poem The Man and the Echo posed the question, did that play of mine send out certain men the English shot? The implied answer is not entirely clear. But the anxiety that poetry does indeed have the power to make things happen is evident. In his book Poetry, Poets, Readers, Making Things Happen, the English poet and critic Peter Robinson has devoted much intellectual energy to the issue of whether or not poetry makes things happen. And it's a question that poets and readers, including us here in Scotland now, shouldn't shirk. Scotland is neither Ireland nor America. There are fewer guns here. And it's one of the unusual glories of modern Scottish nationalism that no man, woman or child has been shot or injured as a result of it. Yet we can and do learn from aligning ourselves with Irish, American, Australian and other poetries. In her book, Songs of Herself, The Uses of Poetry in America, the historian Joan Shelley Rubin shows how one of the jobs American poetry has done is to say, I am an American. Yeats, some of whose finest poems clearly and conflictedly say, I am Irish, gives the lie to any assertion that poetry cannot or should not be political and cannot take on a bardic national voice with aplomb. Yet Yeats also vigorously asserts the poet's impulse to cut away from the political and follow the sometimes lustful lyric impulse. His late poem Politics begins, how can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? And this poem concludes with the simple and lamenting exclamation, but oh that I were young again and held her in my arms. I salute Yeats's wandering eye. There's poetry in it, as there was in his hopeless, intrepid pursuit of Maud Gonne decades earlier. But I honour too his continuing engagement, however difficult, with politics. And I think we should reflect on that here in Edinburgh in 2015. For if Yeats is emblematic of the great political poet, then he is also an emblem of long and sometimes anguished bardic waiting. And waiting is certainly the situation in which we find ourselves in today's Scotland. No sooner was our referendum narrowly lost, a swing of 6% would have made all the difference, than it seemed in the most recent UK general election that the cause of Scottish independence, as if on the rebound, was on a winning streak. For those of us who want to see an independent Scotland, the issue now is how best to wait, how to endure waiting, and how to sustain that waiting. Well, Yeats waited. We tend to bunch all Yeats's poems together, but it's important to realise the decades of waiting that characterised his career as a poet. Poetry is good at sustaining, at keeping open long lines of communication. Yeats, the poet of urgency, was also a great poet of committed resilience. His sustaining lines of communication running to Indian and Japanese and ancient Greek culture, as well as to London, to Oxford, to Stone Cottage, to Dublin and to Sligo. It was in the early 1890s, 3 decades before the founding of an Irish Free State, that he addressed himself to Ireland in the coming times, and wanted to be brother of a company of distinctively Irish nationalist poets. It was over 20 years later that The Terrible Beauty was born, and it was almost another 20 years before Yeats, the parliamentary senator, would assert with regard to vague utopianism that he could produce an image of such politics. As an image of such politics, a withered old and a skeleton gone to humanity. Yeats is an inspiration. His resilient and lyrical waiting paid off. But Yeats is also a sounder of warnings against making the heart a stone, against poetry simply and only as propaganda. Poetry, including bardic poetry, And perhaps no successful poetry is purely bardic in the most reductive sense of that word, must be something subtler and more oblique than propaganda, while still asserting a public voice. Most of Yeats's poetry is not political in any explicit sense, even if he could rise on key occasions to being a great political poet. Yeats's bardic example may be set beside Burns's bardic example as a magnificent example of a poet who can be political without renouncing his gift. Burns's bardic humour is glorious and sets him apart from Yeats. But Burns is also a serious political poet. The song that begins Scots Wha Hae is clearly a song of Scottish independence, but also a song of the Enlightenment. It's a tune to the French Revolution as well as to Bannockburn. Yet most of Burns's work is not so directly political. The bulk of MacDiarmid's best poems are not directly political either. No, or at least not narrowly. Same goes for Neruda, for Seferis, that great poet, translator, diplomat, true not just to the Greek past, but to the uncanny and universal secrets of the sea that are forgotten on the shore. Who in their right mind would choose to represent Hugh MacDiarmid by one of his hymns to Lenin, rather than by Empty Vessel or the Bonnie Brook at Bearn? It's good to think here in the National Library about poetry and politics, not just in the immediate arena of 2015, but also in much wider contexts. Whatever else they need to be, poets must at times be bookish. That is, they need to read deeply and love their art, not just in their own country and community, but across space and time. That's what nourishes us. Poems need to live on the breath and in the moment, but they need too to be able to last, to move across boundaries of chronology and culture. Good poetry doesn't belong exclusively to one generation, either living or dead. Each of us, if we write verse, must find our own way of articulating that. For my part, since the referendum, I've been working on a bunch of poems about individual Scottish cities. But also I'm trying to put together a book now in Scots called Chinese Mackers, where the poems have absolutely nothing to do with Scottish politics. I hope that to work like this, like writing about T.S. Eliot, is a way of keeping open those long lines of communication that poetry offers, and which too narrow adherence to any one party line of political cause can threaten to atrophy. Whatever else it is, 2015 is a time to assert and reassert internationalism in this country, which doesn't mean forgetting about locality or the issue of independence. One of the most arresting questions asked about art and the referendum came, I think, from our greatest living composer, James Macmillan, when he asked, where was the great art to come out of the referendum? Out of all that yes campaigning. You can bounce that question back, of course. Where was the great art of no? Yet instead of just doing that, and perhaps just to induce more cultural anxiety, one might ask, where is the great art that's appeared since the referendum vote? And yet I think to think that way is misguided, over-anxious, over-myopic. Again, it's important to stand back and take a wider perspective. In terms of Scottish poetry, it does seem hard to ignore that so many of the poets of recent times, from MacDiarmid and MacCaig to Lochhead and Jamie, have been supporters of independence. Yet though it may be valid to do so at certain times, there are dangers in looking at their work or their public pronouncements, or their private pronouncements, only in search of political commitment. To do so may be valid, but it's also short-sighted. If we take a longer, larger view of the politics of poetry, then what's more striking is the absence of support for British unionism in modern poetry from these islands as a whole. It's as easy to find great poetry that articulates a sense of England, history is now and England, in the poetry of last century, as it is to locate poetry that attempts, often successfully, to articulate kinds of Scottishness or Irishness. Yet the poetry of Britishness, as distinct from merely jingoistic verse, is very hard to find in recent decades. That fact of poetic politics tells its own story, and it's a story repeated in fiction. If you remove from literary history the powerful Scottish Unionist articulations of some supposed Britishness voiced in the 18th and 19th centuries by novelist poets including Tobias Smollett and Walter Scott, then it's stunning how little articulation of Britishness there is in fiction produced from England itself. No major English novel is set in Scotland, for instance, with the questionable exception of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which may be nominally located in the Hebrides, but whose milieu smacks very much of the beautiful southwest English environment of Woolf's childhood summers. Ultimately, this failure to articulate positive ideals of Britishness is a very striking aspect of literature from England by English writers. And though 18th and 19th century Scottish writers attempted to remedy that by championing in rural Britannia and elsewhere an ideal of a united Britain, which included Caledonia, Stern and Wilde, it's hard to discern this British strain in Scottish literature beyond John Buchan. So what I'm arguing is that taking a wider scale view of Scottish, English and British literature strengthens, rather than in any sense compromises, the view that the auguries of writing in poetry as in fiction continue to point in the direction of Scottish independence. Taking such a view may sustain our waiting. We should not expect masterworks to appear every other Wednesday. We should not beat ourselves up unduly if even in 2014 no clear masterwork was published to articulate the dream of Scottish independence in poetry. Instead, while taking into account the textual evidence of such immediate productions as Christopher Silver's 2014 anthology Inspired by Independence, to which many of us in the room, like others, are delighted to contribute, we should realise too that such a book and other literary gatherings are part of a much wider carrying stream that certainly does include impressive individual works and bodies of writing from the recent and more distant past. Among these, surely, and now sifted by time, are the work of Alistair Gray and Edwin Morgan. And sustainingly, though Morgan died in 2010 and Gray is now seriously ill, 2015 has brought significant signs that the work of each of these writers continues to inform and underpin debates about literary politics. In Gray's case, David Gregg's striking theatrical adaptation of Lanark now presents a stage version made by an important dramatist vehement in his support for the Yes campaign in 2014 of the most famous novel by a Scottish novelist celebrated for his commitment to this cause of Scottish independence. While Lanark is certainly not the same book as Gray's Why Scots Should Rule Scotland, nonetheless, as I've argued in Bannockburn's, Gray's perennial theme of the individual who seeks independence from a situation of entrapment can be seen as having a political dimension, and one that persists in the context of today's Scotland. For readers of Edwin Morgan, the publication of his large selected correspondence in the Midnight Letterbox this year serves to emphasise that most of Morgan's literary interests were not political. Indeed, it can be amusing to see him in 1968 wondering if people may react to a poet's politics simply in terms of, as he puts it, oh, I see old MacDiarmid's at it again, meaning that it's a sort of poet's privilege to be interested in politics, but nevertheless to be fairly likely to be foolish, unquote. Morgan was wary of the too narrowly Scottish. And though his imaginative fascination with metamorphosis does have a political dimension, one detects surprisingly little interest in Scottish politics in this particular selection of his letters, chunky though it is, which came out this year. And the interest that is there in that selection of his letters, at least, comes relatively late. In 1987, he writes how Alan Brownjohn of the Poetry Society in London is collecting poets' voting intentions plus reasons for choice. I said SNP since I saw Scotland as a frustrated republic and would like to help it to become a real one. This is the Morgan who had published Sonnets from Scotland in 1984 with its Res Publica Scotorum, and who later in 1990, the year that saw the publication of his enlarged collected poems, thought that politically, I'm quoting again, it is a very strange moment when almost everyone believes some constitutional and or other change is standing at the door, and necessarily so, yet a combination of nervous and nerveless hands seems unable to grasp the knob and open up. Soon afterwards, in 1992, Morgan complained how we are up against a government that not only means to preserve the Union, but is searching for ways to strengthen it. And one can only hope it overreaches itself in this and thereby precipitates a broader discontent than manifests itself at the moment. I don't believe poetry makes nothing happens, Morgan wrote in a letter of 1998. And 6 years later, he was invited by Jack McConnell to become the inaugural Scottish Macker, going on to produce his poem for the opening of the Scottish Parliament that was quoted earlier. Morgan, on the 9th of October 2004, was too ill to read his poem to the parliamentarians. He was read by Liz Lochhead, who would succeed him as Macker. But it stands, I think, as a signally successful piece of bardic oratory, a public poem of which Scotland remains rightly proud. Open the doors, light of the day, shine in, light of the mind, shine out. Let me acknowledge again the danger with the phrase bardic voice is that it sounds old-fashioned, linked inextricably to Yeatsian last romantics. In Scotland, though, Morgan gave the lie to that, while still managing to draw on what he called the poetic resources of Scotland, as well as on an astonishingly wide range of poetic sustenance from Gilgamesh to Ginsberg. And it was Morgan who, in the penultimate dictated email of the Midnight Letterbox, the collection of his letters that came out this year, produced a tellingly astute statement on the public role of the poet as laureate. Never a party hack, and it's important to remember that Morgan was not a joiner of political parties. He did attempt with grace a bardic voice, conscious of writing as a national poet at a time when, and I'm quoting again, the people of Scotland are, I think, quite certain of a movement in politics and society that is developing towards a very different way of looking at things, a Scottish as compared to an English way. The two nations, if we want to use that term, are still closely attached, but moving from that towards some kind of separation, although there may be argument about what degree of separation there should ultimately be. Morgan's thoughts here are too long to quote in full, but are worth reading in the Midnight Letterbox. There he goes on to invoke the Hungarian national poet Petőfi and his national song, before concluding that this work was a reminder that a national poetry should not be involved in clinging to any particular political idea or writing for money, and is certainly not to be seen as a passing gift, whether granted by a queen or anyone else. Rather, poetry at this level should remind people that if they want to achieve something in the world and to really be taken seriously, then they need to show the world what they stand for. And surely those who are best equipped to articulate this are good writers, and this includes poets. Though he certainly did not use the term, and though, as a gay man who had kept his sexuality secret for decades, and in other ways, he certainly understood the need for private voice. What Morgan is articulating here is the case for what I'm calling bardic voice in poetry. Bardic voice needs to be a crafted, sometimes unfashionably rhetorical tone of address. It shouldn't be stuffy. It's present in Dunbar, in Burns, and in many other poets, and it remains a valid and urgent, though not the only valid and urgent, kind of voice to be heard in 2015, as it was in 2014, and as it has been for centuries before. To be a poet in Scotland now means, on occasion, to take the risk of bardic voice. Not because we can be sure the work will last, but because of a deep desire to risk articulating something that matters. That's what led to some of us risking bardic voice in 2014, and leads me still to stand by and to voice, both personally and hopefully inclusively, that risk.